All right. All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and call to order the September 5th, 2024 Land Use and Natural Resources Committee meeting. And to kick us off here, Pledge of Allegiance. So let's see, Director Frost, would you lead us in the pledge? Sorry.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right, very good. All right, so if the clerk will call the roll.
Yes, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bulahan. Here. Frost. Harris, absent. Hume.
Here.
Kozlowski.
Also here.
Peter.
Here.
Vang, absent. Vice Chair Baines.
Present.
Vice Chair Lozano, absent. Chair Villegas.
Here.
We have a quorum.
All right, very good. All right, so ask the clerk if there's any communication that needs to be shared or any initial public comment.
We do have one public comment, is from David Schwiegel.
Right, welcome, David. Sure.
I'm live. All right. Good afternoon, SACOG Land Use and Natural Resources Committee. My name is David Schwegel, and I am starting a nonprofit called North America for True High-Speed Rail, where the focus will be on development of high-speed rail throughout the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Rail Yards project here in Sacramento. Back in 2009, the New York Times published an article that claimed that the Sacramento Rail Yards was the nation's largest urban infill project. It's 15 years later, and the most amazing thing has happened. Absolutely nothing. And what really shocks me is they determined that Kaiser on Morse Avenue in Sacramento was not up to seismic codes. What I don't understand is why they didn't really take the wrecking ball, take that hospital out, and build like crazy the Kaiser or the rail yards. We need to encourage as much as we can expedited progress on completing these urban infill projects. Speaking of urban infill, Elk Grove comes to mind. I understand Elk Grove's most significant pain point is half a job per dwelling unit, and a very major shortage of jobs within the city itself. And that's the second largest city in the entire Sacramento region. What I'd like to see in Elk Grove, now that we know that the Ultimate Corridor Express is going to have a station in Elk Grove, is major station area development, an actual high-speed rail station. The station area development that will rival that of the Sacramento Rail Yards. Finally, I am starting this nonprofit, North America for True High-Speed Rail, based on the proceeds from the book that I'm working on called High Speed Trains, Bringing People Together, because after all, this is about bringing people together, the work that we do in transportation and land use. And the goal is to generate enough revenue to get an actual conference here in Sacramento next May that will be a high-speed rail summit and advocacy day. So we'll be keeping you updated on how that progresses. But in the meantime, let's do everything possible we can to encourage urban infill projects to take place. Visit Crystal City, Virginia. As you're walking around Crystal City, Virginia, keep in mind they beat out 237 other municipalities to get Amazon HQ 2.0.
1 minute remaining.
And use that as a means for determining what the Sacramento Rail Yards and the Elk Grove TOD project can become. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk, for your comments. Right, if there are no other slips to speak, that takes us then to the consent agenda. Do we have any comments on, any public comment on the consent?
There's no public comment.
No comments. We have a motion and a second for approving the consent agenda, which is the minutes from the August 1st meeting. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Consent is approved. That takes us to the one action item that we do have, and then we have an informational item shortly thereafter. The one action item is the Green Means Go grant submittal.
Well, good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. Garrett Valrosa, SACOG staff. So we're several years into our Green Means Go program here at SACOG. And of course, Green Means Go looks to accelerate infill development in local green zones, which all of your cities and counties have nominated. We're really pleased about the progress that we've had in these last several years, but Green Means Go has been entirely grant funded. So we're always looking for ways to continue the ability to keep Green Means Go investments flowing. So we've been tracking grant programs at the state and federal level. We have another one on our radar that we want to talk about today. It's through the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department, or HUD, and it's called Pro Housing. So again, what we've done so far in the Green Means Go program has been successful in bringing in revenues to fund infrastructure, the sewer, the water, the stormwater, the backbone infrastructure. That's been great. That's super important. We can continue to look for opportunities for that. This grant program we're talking about today is a bit different. The funding available is much smaller, and what they've talked about in the guidelines is more on the policy and planning side. So we're putting together a proposal, not for infrastructure, but for planning and technical assistance. And the theme around it is really pathways to affordable homeownership. Like many regions across the country, this is something that's sort of eroding through time. And so we really think there's opportunities to be talking about what we can be doing collectively as a region, to be thinking about bringing on more product types that are more inherently affordable for a wide variety of residents. So still a lot of work to do to piece this together. We're standing up a public process, including a hearing next week. Comment section is live on this, so we're seeking input. But basically the idea is two main buckets of activities we would be pursuing this grant application. The first is housing policy implementation. There's a lot of new law coming out at the state level, but fewer resources to implement at the local level, right? And so we identify two in particular in the staff report. That's about small lot subdivisions and accessory dwelling units, right? The need to think about resources to update ordinances, code, and also getting information and coordinated approach out. So this first bucket in housing policy implementation would bring resources to the local jurisdictions around that type of housing policy. The second bucket is technical assistance. Through Green Means Go, we've stood up this arm of technical assistance. We've been working with the Urban Land Institute on some studies, and then we were fortunate to have this little housing accelerator in Yuba City and Marysville. The idea would be to learn what we did from that sort of pilot stage, scale it up, and we're still thinking through, we have a couple ideas you'll see in the staff report, continue that sort of housing accelerator for the jurisdictions, consider how we could also better work with special districts, the sewer and water providers themselves, and potentially the development community, and in particular, the skills around building this type of housing affordable products. So again, housing policy implementation and technical assistance. We're using this month of September to sort of, refine those ideas, and we have that public process we've stood up. The ask is that you would move this forward to the board, that would be authorized to apply for an application October 15th. So this would be the boards would hear it in their September meeting. You as the Lunar Committee would hear it again in October, our final sort of proposal, but the board wouldn't be able to hear it again in October because applications would be due before that. So again, the ask is authorize staff to move forward to the board, for them to consider authorizing staff for us to move forward with this application. And I'm happy to answer what questions you have.
Right, very good. Thank you for that. We don't have any slips to speak, right? So no public comment. Did you hold that up just now? Is that what that was?
I did, like we discussed last week.
That's for me, clearly. That's for me. All right. Yes, flashcards, yes. Okay, so are there any directional questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a question regarding well, first of all, my first question is, I noticed that in the background, the purpose is to remove barriers to affordable housing production, and affordable conveniently has a lowercase.
Yep.
And that is intentional?
That is intentional. It's not
Okay.
capital A.
Okay.
Affordable, yeah.
And then my second question is AB 1033, is that bill already passed? Or is it working its way through the legislature?
I'm going to bring up my colleague, Bob Caden, who can speak more to this. My understanding is it is passed.
Hi there. Yes, both of the bills that were referenced in the staff report have been passed. So 1033 was actually a bill that came up in our, I believe, last discussion when we were talking with Cascadia. But that is a totally elective bill. So it creates an opportunity for local governments to allow for ADUs to be sold separately as condos, but does not require it.
Okay, and so as that is now trickled down to this agency, what role do we play in either encouraging or discouraging the electability of that bill?
Yeah. So, well, do you want to?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So it's a totally elective thing. I think the idea would be, if we were to receive this grant, we would be looking to our member agencies to potentially explore that option. It's not going to be for everyone, but we think it does offer a really interesting opportunity for lowercase a affordable homeownership opportunities, given that ADUs tend to be a lot smaller. You're not having to pay for land. I have an ADU in my backyard. It's probably like I would say it sells for maybe by itself, 250, 300. You don't find that sort of price in my neighborhood otherwise. And so it's creating an opportunity for folks to kind of enter the homeownership market.
Okay. I'll just be on record. I'm vehemently opposed to the idea of being able to sell ADUs as individual homes. So I will not be encouraging our agency to do that.
Yes, sir.
While we have Doug, the, up to 8.
Director Kozlowski, if you could use your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are ADUs discounted in their counting for RENA? Like, can you assume that there will be ADUs on pieces of property and count them as potential affordable units for RENA purposes?
Yes. So this is,
And does this change that in some way? Because I seem to recall that there's a discount. Like, you can say that there'll be ADUs on all of those lots, but you only get to take credit for 30% or something like that.
right.
I don't know what the numbers are.
Yeah. So this is a whole can of worms, but I'll do my best. So the approach that the state took as a part of our housing elements in this last cycle, which were adopted in 2021, was that you could make an assumption for how many ADUs you expected to build as a jurisdiction over an 8-year period. And that was tied to an extrapolation of trends. So you as a jurisdiction, City of Folsom would have, we built this many ADUs in 2019 and 2020 and 2021. Based on that trends, we're extrapolating that for 8 years. You can then assume, we actually helped with this, SACOG did, a percentage of those ADUs to be affordable. It's a bit of a guessing game, and every jurisdiction made their own guess. We tried to provide some assistance with how you could go about making that assumption, but it was a case-by-case basis.
Got it. Okay, very good. How much money is available from the federal program?
There's 100 million available competitively at the federal level. So apps need to be between 1 million and 7 million. We reviewed everything that was awarded last cycle. It's the second cycle. So we're targeting, we think maybe 1.5 or 2 million as a sweet spot. And we do know it's a highly competitive program. Last cycle, it was oversubscribed by about 15 to 1. So we want to stay on the lower end of that range.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's in part why staff's recommending the pathway versus a more traditional infrastructure piece that we would normally do. How we would implement a grant like this should we be successful. Any other questions? Well, we don't have any slips. No public. Let me read that. No comma, public comment. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. Okay. So this is an action item. So we do need a motion to move forward, assuming.
Mr. Chairman, I will move that we make the recommendation to
the board.
send this to the full board.
Second the motion.
Motion and a second. All those signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No opposed. Okay. All right. We are going to move next to our informational item, and I think we've scheduled at least 45 minutes for this one, which is the remainder of our time for the most part.
There we go. All right. Good afternoon, Zach Miller. I'm the program manager for the 2025 Blueprint, our Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy. So the presentation today is really going to focus on the investment priorities as well as the draft transportation project list for the plan, the 2025 Blueprint. So just to go over the agenda real quick, I'm going to start off with some questions I would like you all to keep in mind as I go through the presentation. I'm going to stop twice, once in the middle, once at the end of the presentation, to ask specific questions that relate to those portions of the presentation. I'll be diving into the steps that have already been completed on this front in terms of developing the transportation project list, and I'll also be touching on what we're working towards here. And then finally, we'll discuss where we're falling in terms of the fiscal constraint aspect, as well as the plan performance with this new transportation project list incorporated. So the questions to consider. So as we continue the process of developing and refining the transportation project list here for the plan, we're looking to get feedback from you all today, obviously. So in addition to any general questions or any questions that may pop up or comments you may have, we're also looking to get some very specific feedback related to the transportation investments across the budget categories and the near-term transportation project priorities for your respective jurisdictions. So I'll be proposing the question at the end of each relevant section, as I noted earlier, but wanted to provide them up front as well for you, for your consideration and to start getting the wheels turning on them. So, so the first question, does the way that the budget is divided, which I'll show you a slide that has the actual budget breakdown, amongst those categories, does that make sense to you and is it in line with your understanding of both regional as well as local needs and priorities? And then obviously near the end of the presentation, I'll be asking the question of if there are major transportation projects that you know of that are near-term priorities for your jurisdiction that warrant further discussion with said jurisdiction. So as I go through this presentation, please keep in mind, as I mentioned at the September meeting as well, that the process of really refining this transportation project list that the staff is currently undertaken is really, it comes out of necessity. So as we just don't have enough money to build all the transportation projects that have been nominated for inclusion as part of this plan, the 2025 blueprint. So getting into where we've been. So we've gone over these steps a number of times earlier this year in a number of different meetings. So I'm not going to revisit every single one of these steps. But the list you see on the screen in front of you really shows the process and engagement that has been undertaken to date. So first and foremost, I'll be outlining later in the presentation the triple bottom line framework of equity, economy, and the environment, along with those policy statements within the framework that was used to guide not only the development of the land use assumptions, as you'll remember, but also we use that to help guide the transportation project list refinement that you'll hear about today. Then back in 2022, SACOG staff worked with transportation project sponsors to review and nominate projects for inclusion in the 2025 blueprint. So this was really the first step of this process of developing the transportation project list. So next, as part of development and evaluation of the land use assumptions, or as you may remember, the discussion scenario, which we called it that you heard about back in April, a scaled back transportation project list was developed and included as part of that informational item back in April. So this step primarily concentrated on really ensuring that the land uses that were included in the discussion scenario were served by adequate transportation infrastructure. Then while those land use assumptions were being finalized earlier in this year, SACOG staff continued to really engage with transportation project sponsors in order to really get their comments, suggested changes, prioritization, things of that sort on that initial list that they saw in April as part of the discussion scenario. Then moving on to where we're going. So with the goal of adopting the final scenario of the plan in November and adoption of the land use assumptions this last June, we've now really turned our attention to this very last piece of the puzzle, which is this transportation project list and these transportation investments. So after the initial call for transportation projects in 2022, earlier this year, we began phase one of a more focused transportation project sponsor engagement effort. So this phase of the sponsor engagement was really focused on input and comments, as I just mentioned, on the very first iteration of that transportation project list, which was the discussion scenario list. So the next step in the engagement process is what we're calling phase two of the transportation project sponsor engagement, and that has already begun. So we released this draft transportation project list last Thursday to all transportation project sponsors, and we're asking for them to provide comments and set up meetings with us to discuss any comments, concerns, issues that they have with the list. So we've already scheduled a number of meetings. We held a meeting earlier with a local jurisdiction earlier this morning, actually, and we have a whole host of additional meetings set up. But I think later on in the presentation, I'll be asking that question of if there are other projects that you would like us to engage local jurisdictions with. Then just looking at the overarching schedule here, so for the rest of the year, as you can see, we plan to bring a revised transportation project list back to this committee for final review and comments in October next month. So you'll see a revised copy of the transportation project list, taking into account all the feedback and input we received, not only at this meeting and the transportation committee meeting that we had this morning, but also from all those transportation project sponsors. And then in November, we plan to bring you all the final scenario for adoption. And that final scenario is made up of the land use assumptions that you've already adopted, and then combining the transportation project list with that. And that makes up the final scenario. Once we have the final scenario adopted, then we can really move forward on the environmental review and the actual plan writing, and getting into a lot of those policies for the plan. So now I'll be getting into the approach that we're taking in development and refinement of the transportation project list. Before we jump into that, I want to note a few important things here. So first, as I mentioned earlier, we simply don't have enough funding to build all of the projects that were nominated for inclusion in the 2025 blueprint. And in fact, based on our draft budget estimates, you'll see here in a few slides as well that the cost of all the nominated roadway and highway capacity projects is nearly twice the amount of funding that we anticipate having for the timeframe of the plan for that specific major project category. So this means that some projects are inherently not going to make it into the 2025 blueprint. But that doesn't mean that these projects can't continue to move forward. These projects can still move forward with their planning and development, design stages, and local funding can still be used to move these projects forward all the way through completion even. Also, as an important note here is that the 2025 blueprint is a living document in that if a transportation project is not included in this iteration of the MTPSCS, the 2025 blueprint, that does not mean that it cannot, specific transportation project cannot be amended into the plan at a later date. So for example, if there is a transportation project that is needed and is triggered based on a certain level of development, say in a specific plan area, and that specific plan area is not in the 2025 blueprint currently. If that plan, that specific plan area and the land use development grows at a pace faster than we anticipate in our plan, and it triggers the need for a transportation improvement or a transportation project, then we can bring that project into the plan even mid-cycle, even before the next cycle of the MTPSCS. And that can be done through in the very near term, the 2025 MTIP amendment, for example, or the 2026 MTIP adoption. And then also in the more mid and long term, you can bring in projects specifically during those MTPSCS cycles. So if a project, for example, if you're thinking of projects in the later years of the plan, 2045, 2050, something along those lines, there are going to be multiple cycles of the plan prior to those projects coming to fruition. So there is time to bring them in the long term as well. All right, and it jumped forward a little quickly. I also wanted to note here that getting the first 10 years or so of funding allocation correct is probably the most important part of this plan. So that should be the focus here, as this is a living document and it will be updated, 3-4 times before those later year projects come about. So there will be ample opportunity to get those later year projects into the plan. And then of course we have our policy objectives of meeting the greenhouse gas target, as well as, the policy objectives around our triple bottom line. All right, so now I'm going to get into the approach for development of the transportation project list. So this may look familiar to you. This is very similar to a slide that was used for the land use assumptions, the development of the land use assumptions. So in developing the transportation project list, it is a must that we demonstrate fiscal constraint. So that is a requirement, a federal requirement of this plan. And then obviously there is the must of achieving the greenhouse gas target. So we remain eligible for a lot of very important state funding. And then we optimize for the triple bottom line policy goals, obviously, and then also try to optimize based on local feedback as well as prioritization we receive from local transportation project sponsors in this case. So I went into a lot greater depth on a lot of these aspects of the approach at our last meeting, but this is a general framework and approach that we really work from in developing this transportation project list. I also want to note here that this is a draft list. It's not going to be perfect at this point. And there will be things we may have missed or need to be corrected at this point. And that's exactly why we're conducting this, phase 2 of this transportation project sponsor engagement. And so I'd like to note here that we are in fact in the process of coordinating with several agencies, one being STA, the other being SAC-RT, on ensuring that we get the transportation project list correct. So we'll start with the must, that the plan must demonstrate fiscal constraint. So as a reminder, fiscal constraint really refers to the requirement that the financial resources available are sufficient to cover the cost of the planned transportation projects and programs within the plan. So just as a reminder, question to keep in mind as I work through this portion of the presentation, does the way the budget is divided up, you'll see it in a couple slides here, reflect both regional and local needs and priorities? So before I get to that slide with those major budget categories, I want to touch on and start this discussion on fiscal constraint in the plan by putting into context that shortfall in available funding in relation to the regional wants and needs, specifically in terms of the short-term projects included in the plan and the MTIP. So going back to 2018, all the way through today, the region has captured about $2 billion in discretionary grant funding for transportation projects within the plan. So as you can see on this table in front of you, that's broken down by county or near-term program of projects, the MTIP contains about $5 billion worth of transportation projects that are at various stages of development at, between environmental clearance, right-of-way acquisition, as well as construction. So while many of these projects have secured some funding already for particular phases, there still is a substantial funding gap of more than $3 billion the region is facing to get these near-term projects over the finish line. So this remaining need represents the total cost of future phases, primarily construction phases, that will occur outside of the years of the MTIP, so beyond 2028 or so. So will the blueprint really contain sufficient revenue to build these projects? The completion of these projects really largely depends on our ability to secure federal and or state grants or come up with new local sources of funds. So this is all to say that while new projects are programmed in the MTIP on a regular basis, an important financial constraint consideration in the 2025 blueprint is fully funding those near-term program projects before introducing new projects and even more future need for the region. Now jumping into the budget across these major project categories, which that question I had up a bit earlier specifically refers to. So this table compares the 6 major project categories you'll see on the table in the column on the left. And it compares those to the adopted plan, our 2020 MTP SCS, and those estimates that we have for our 2025 blueprint. So first, I really want to highlight the maintenance and rehabilitation and as well as the road and highway capacity project categories and the needs or requests that have been communicated to us at this point. So for maintenance and rehab for that category, there's a need of $21 billion in funding approximately. So the region is currently facing a growing backlog of maintenance and rehab needs. The draft 2025 blueprint revenue forecast really aims to slow or reverse this trend by prioritizing some existing and new sources of funding to support local maintenance programs. But even with these funding sources, the preliminary budget of about, 14 billion is unlikely to fully meet our needs as a region for the maintenance and rehab. And then similarly for the road and highway capacity projects, there were over $13 billion worth of projects nominated during the project nomination process. So more than 40% of this budget category is comprised of projects that are already moving through various stages of project development today. But they still have a large funding gap needed to cover the full cost of construction, as you saw on that previous slide. So the plan's draft budget really prioritizes securing sufficient funding to get these projects, these more near-term projects, over the finish line before introducing additional expansion projects. But you can see how the need is vastly outpacing the revenue available to fund these projects. Additionally, I think it's important to note that while we have some flexibility within funding sources, for example, the region can choose to put more or less of SACOG's regional grants into maintenance rather than expansion. There are strings attached to a good deal of the funding included in this plan, and this limits our ability to allocate that money to a different project category. And you can see that in the dedicated funding column in front of you. And we've also provided a flexible column on there as well. Yeah.
Excuse me, some clarification about this chart. So if the MTPSES in 2020 identified, for instance, bicycle and pedestrian needs of $2.5 billion, is the preliminary 2025 blueprint additive to that? The 2.7 that's shown in the second column, is that, am I understanding that to be in addition or just 200 million and more?
The latter.
The second one,
Yeah,
okay,
second one.
so,
It's a slight increase. That increase is reflected mainly as we're going a little further out than what was in the last plan.
okay, I just wanted to make sure so that we weren't anticipating adding $2 billion to that
Yeah.
number every 5 years.
So projects in the previous plan that were completed, those would drop off, but those that weren't completed as of yet would theoretically.
And the time
rolled
horizon
forward.
that we expect the need for this funding to fall in is 2025 till when?
2050, the horizon year of the
2050.
plan.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right, just clarity. All right,
Yep.
thank you.
yeah, of
Fair.
course.
I also had a question. This was table 1 in the staff report. And so in the flexible column, that's simply dollars that are not assigned to specific projects. Is that?
The dedicated funding aren't yet fully assigned to specific projects. They're assigned to specific types of projects. So think all of the FTA money we get can only be spent on transit. So the flexible stuff would be things like the regional funding programs that we have at SACOG. You could spend that on bike ped, you could spend it on transit, or you could spend it on roads. It's not committed to one of these major categories. So like your SB1 road maintenance and rehab, you can only spend it on that. So the dedicated is type of project that it can be spent on, but we don't do a full program of projects for the next 25 years in the plan. It's a much broader set of expenditures or a budget than what you might see in like a capital improvement program.
Okay, so that's actually a different answer than I was anticipating. So let me clarify that I heard what you just said. So then the monies that are in the flexible column can be moved into other rows.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that's a nice segue into the actual question that I had posed earlier. So is the way that the budget is divided up amongst these project categories, does it make sense to you? And does it reflect both regional and local needs and priorities? And I'll go back to the table here as you noodle on that.
Can you maybe describe what some of the things included in that last row, the program, safety, systems management, and operations, what that covers?
Yeah. So that could include, sorry, thank you, Robert. That could include your
a basic safety project that's not adding capacity to a roadway, turn movements, things like that. It would include things like spare the air. It's a pretty broad category. Spare the air programs, transportation demand management programs like guaranteed ride home, things like that. So operational improvements, signal timing, all of those sorts of things. A lot of the stuff that you would do maybe before you decide to go on a full investment to add a lane or add additional capacity. So it's a broad category for operational investments.
Okay, but it is primarily infrastructure related and not necessarily overhead.
Correct,
Okay.
correct.
That's what I wanted to make sure.
Yeah, yeah. And in the staff report, it does say this, I think it's relevant to your question. There is so much overlap when you're spending in money on transportation. When you're widening a road, you may also be improving pedestrian or signal timing, things like that. So there's a lot of overlap between these categories. This is our best shot at saying, here's the explicit funding that we would be putting in this type of project. So that 7.4 on road and highway capacity is not absent bike lanes and sidewalks and things like that, if those are part of the project scope.
Well, I'll volunteer an opinion. I think the distribution does make sense from my point of view. I don't think everybody in the world would understand how much it costs to maintain and rehabilitate roads. So the fact that the disproportionate amount of this goes to that activity, I think is right on the money and makes good sense if you know how expensive that is. So I'll just point that part out, and I think the rest is sensible.
Does this division of distribution limit the way projects are allocated in the MTPSCS then? In other words, if we had more activity in one area because the market was driving some different thing, then does that limit the way the project funds, the way funds are allocated?
I'll take a crack at it and tell me if I don't quite hit your question on the head. The way that the budget here is allocated is not going to say, next year the county must spend its money in this way. What it does mean is, so for maintenance and rehab, you see that we've got the largest share of the flexible funding kind of going into that category. The way that gets reflected then in the programs and things that the activities that SACOG's engaged in is you've talked about the regional funding programs. We heard through the working group that maintenance and rehab is a hugely important part. So a portion of those, a larger share of those start moving into maintenance and rehab, which does affect the projects that your agency, that Sac County, would bring forward into the regional funding programs. So it affects the allocation in the plan, but year over year grants that you're going after, spending, like Zach said, if a development project is moving forward faster than we anticipated, this does not limit your ability. You can't, the county has spent all of its capacity budget. You can't add more to it because these things come in ebbs and flows. It ebbs and flows. And so this is over a 25-year period. What we're saying, this is our vision for how we want to spend money. It's going to vary greatly from year to year. And then we amend.
Who can step up at the time.
Right. And then the transportation improvement program, the MTIP, is kind of the pointy end of the long range plan. And that's what's being spent now. And so that kind of is changing every single year. In fact, we change that, every month through small changes, and then every year through larger formal amendments.
So Clint, I just asked from the side before that, like, how do you guys, how'd you arrive at those numbers? Some Center counties, like, were they got caught sleeping, or they didn't make a request, or how does that, how
How do we arrive at these numbers?
The
Or
num-
this
that-
this one?
Yeah.
So this is the transportation improvement program. This this is not a reflection of all of the money spent in the region. This is the money that kind of comes through. Thank you. This is the money that comes through our transportation improvement program. So what this is it's a report of what every jurisdiction has currently, we call it programmed in there. So any grants that you've received, if you're spending money on road or highway or transit expansion, those would be considered regionally significant projects. They go into the MTIP. So what this is a report of what you currently have programmed in our 4-year program and how much future need beyond, in this case, 2028, is still waiting for a grant or some sort of funding to come in and get that project over the finish line.
Well, obviously, we need a lot more than that shows up on your slide.
So yeah, this is not the, and that's a huge important point. You do need more than that in Sutter County. What's not in here is road maintenance, all your road maintenance needs. Those don't come through the Transportation Improvement Program. This is, I think the Sutter County projects, that might be Bogue Road and a Bridge Street reconstruction or something. Those are the two larger projects that kind of come into our Transportation Improvement Program. Those have about $9 million in remaining need on them. Doesn't mean it's everything that the county is spending on transportation. It's those things that kind of rise to the level of needing to be programmed through the regional improvement program.
Is it, through the chair,
Does that make any sense?
is it?
No, I'm like, hold on a second. I want to make sure that, Yuba City and Sutter County, we get our fair share. I just don't know if in the past that there was something that somebody dropped the ball along the way and
So what you would have, the reason these are sitting in the program is you would have received either some grant funding or you're moving through preliminary engineering or environmental. So you're spending some money on them. And when you spend money on a regionally significant project, it has to go into the Transportation Improvement Program. A lot of projects make it into that before having secured all of their construction funding. So this is in this case, this is your remaining construction need on those two projects. There hasn't been decisions made yet on future funding and where it's going. This is just a reflection of how much have you already secured and how much do you need to get those, in this case, those two projects over the finish line.
Is this based on like a CIP or a 5-year CIP, or is this
Kind
just a
of.
list that
It's-
our organization gave you, or?
This is the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program. So that document, it's a 4-year document. It's kind of like a capital improvement program. It is not your local CIP. All of the projects that go into that are put in there by local agencies as they're moving through project development. And it is a reflection of really two things. Something that is considered regionally significant, meaning it has an impact to air quality. So we have to capture it in our air quality modeling, or you are using federal or state money on it. One of those two conditions are passed, then it has to get programmed into the MTIP.
Okay, so those numbers right there, do they represent what's in your current project list, what you have identified at this time? And that current project list, my understanding is that it's still moving.
It is still
And
moving,
so there's
yeah.
still input, so those numbers could change.
Those numbers will change.
significantly
Those numbers
by
will change.
November.
They could change by November. In fact, just this morning, the Transportation Committee was looking to adopt the next iteration of our MTIP. We'd expect federal approval by December. And by December, we would potentially get new grant awards, things like that. New funding becomes available. New projects need to get amended in. Developer impact fees become available. They get programmed in. So this is changing on a regular basis. This is a snapshot in time. And really the point here is we've got projects moving through kind of the 4-year pipeline. They're already going through environmental design, but they do not yet have construction funding on them yet. And we want to make sure those projects don't just sit here with an environmental document 15 years down the line. We get them over the finish line with construction funding. So that $3.3 million in remaining need, that's what we need to get secured through state grants, through federal grants, just to get the existing 4-year program of projects completed.
Yeah, but, and I'm assuming you got the letter from the county and you've
Mhm.
already you're working with the county, but there's some projects that you talked about funding gap that are prioritized projects, and they're not completely funded, but they're prioritized and they need to be in the MTP-SCS in order to position to
For
bring it
grants.
home. You're taking that into consideration as well.
Yeah.
That's a consideration.
Yeah.
Thank you.
any last impressions, comments on the way the budget here is allocated across those major project categories before I move on? Not seeing any. All right, so now I'm going to get into how the changes made to the transportation project list that you saw in April associated with the discussion scenario affect the performance of the plan as a whole. So a few things to note here. Although the project list does not reflect the most recent comments and changes asked for by SAC-RT, the modeling that you'll see here does. So we did reflect those SAC-RT changes that they requested in the modeling that you'll see moving forward here. Additionally, there are a number of projects that are listed in the draft project list as pending further discussion with sponsors. For the purposes of the modeling, these projects were not included in the draft final scenario modeling that you'll see in a few slides here. These projects are generally capacity increasing projects, and we need additional information from project sponsors at this time on items such as funding strategy and level of development that will trigger these improvements based on development agreements or funding strategies that may be in place. So those, we're still in discussions with local jurisdictions on those projects that you see pending further discussion in the list. So as you look at the change in performance here, please remember that bringing in all of these projects, for example, say though, the capacity increasing projects would further degrade the overall performance, specifically on the greenhouse gas side. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. And then the question to consider that I'll also pose at the end of this last half of the presentation: are there major projects that you know are near-term priorities for your jurisdiction that warrant further discussion with your local staff? So we're really looking for you to flag any potential projects that we should be engaging with transportation project sponsors on moving forward. And we're also taking a more active role in doing that as well and reaching out to sponsors to try to get meetings scheduled as we speak. So now I'll be jumping into how the scenario performs relative to the policy-based priorities that we're using to develop and refine the transportation project list, and that being the triple bottom line of economy, equity, and the environment. So as I mentioned earlier, we have far more transportation project nominations than we do reasonably available funding to build all these projects. So performance relative to the triple bottom line policy framework was one way that the projects were analyzed, and that being in addition to fiscal constraint, needing to hit our greenhouse gas target, as well as incorporating local feedback and priorities. So nested within the triple bottom line are goal statements, which provide additional details of how the 2025 blueprint should support the equity, economy, and environment. So the table before you really includes a number of performance metrics that correspond with and show performance relative to those goal statements. As you can see in the table in front of you, when compared to what you saw in April on the discussion scenario, this draft final scenario performs similar with the exception of the improvement in the metrics related to the provision of transit. So in those metrics, the draft final scenario performs significantly better as it relates to transit. But as I mentioned before, these modeling results do include all requested changes by SAC-RT. So as we work through the issue of fiscal constraint as it relates to these transit projects, these transit performance metrics may degrade some, but generally they're going to be higher for the draft final scenario than the discussion scenario. And then moving into achieving the greenhouse gas target. So the draft final scenario was really developed and predicated on hitting the greenhouse gas target and being consistent with the triple bottom line adopted by the board. So as you can see, as compared to the discussion scenario, the draft final scenario will result in an increase of 0.1 of a percentage point in greenhouse gas emissions. So although this really seems like a small shift in greenhouse gas emissions, the 0.1% is the amount by which we achieved our greenhouse gas target for the last plan cycle, the 2020 MTP-SCS. So even though it seems like a relatively small shift, it is meaningful relative to the challenge we have in meeting our target. So the draft final scenario shows that the region is approximately within 1.15%. So we're 1.15% short of achieving the greenhouse gas reduction target through a combination of location efficient land uses and transportation investments, and a handful of other strategies that were discussed by the board in the fall of 2023, as well as earlier this year. So those were included as reduction measures, and you can see those listed in the rows as you move down the table. So as you can see, we've moved a bit further away from achieving our target as compared to the discussion scenario with the revisions to the transportation project list. And while we're still within striking distance of the target, and we have some additional strategies that we could implement, if the greenhouse gas performance of the plan further degrades between now and November, it will make it increasingly difficult to hit the target and remain eligible for some of that important state transportation funding. So with that, I'd like to open it up and ask and pose the question of, are there major projects that you want to flag for us as staff at SACOG to be engaging with local jurisdictions on at this time? And also answer any other questions you may have.
Correct. There's no public comment on this item.
Thank you, Chair. First, I want to go back to the table that Director Baines was asking about. Is it a fair assumption to say that in the near term unfunded needs, that the first column, the first column is projects that have dedicated funding associated with them, and then the other column is needs that have been identified for which there is no funding?
The first column is the total project cost. So what is currently sitting in the program that our transportation program is the 5.1 billion. Of that 5.1, we still need $3.3 billion in funding.
Okay, which is actually the question I meant to ask. So then the difference is the projects that are funded.
It's the components of projects.
The
that are
components of
funded.
projects.
Yeah.
And so then the distribution by jurisdiction, how was that determined? And why I asked that is because in extrapolating out the percentages, even though Sutter County had such a meager identification, they're only getting 10% of their needs met. Whereas Yuba County, and I'm not trying to pit one county against another, is getting 53% of their project needs met.
The MTIP is it's not like a series of SACOG decisions that decide how this is allocated. It is more a product of what are the type of investments that a jurisdiction is making. If you're making a lot of investments in road maintenance, those are never going to show up here in the tip. If you're doing a lot of local investments, you're using local cash or sales tax cash on an operational improvement, that may never show up here. So there's a lot of spending that won't show up here. This is those projects that kind of rise to the level where we would need to put them in our travel model to see, does this have an impact on air quality? Or you've got a federal or a state grant, a RAISE grant, or a SACOG grant, an FTA grant, any of those. Any of that has to be listed in this administrative document. So what the allocation there is not you wouldn't want to look at it as is everybody getting their fair share?
Yeah.
It's a product of what are they working on? Does it rise to the level to need to be listed in the regional improvement program? And if yes, then we're going to go ahead and program, if you're working on your environmental phase, your right-of-way phase, as soon as you have construction on it, we're going to program that for you. So this is the combination of all those grants, all that local spending on that set of projects that are moving into the system. This is what still needs to be spent to get them over the hump. Okay. So the geographic distribution is more a product of, how many projects do you have going through the system at once? Okay. And it fluctuates greatly from year to year. One project in Sutter County, if you have a big bridge project, could triple that amount next year, right? So it's going to change very frequently. I think the main point is like, man, we have a lot of projects moving through the system and they need a lot of capital investment still. And so we want to really focus on getting the grant funding needed for those.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Now to the question at hand regarding specific projects.
Mhm.
Our staff has reviewed the list, and there are projects that are listed as pending further discussion, some of which are either under construction or have been let out for the design phase, and so they're real projects at this point. Do you want me to get into that level of detail now, or I know that there's a meeting coming up between county staff and SACOG staff?
All of those, yeah, we've got a meeting set with those. I don't think we need you to necessarily go through all of those. They've given us a pretty clear set. The reason that you're seeing those pending further discussion, there's a lot of them. The reason those are listed as pending further discussion is we got those late in the process. It was actually really helpful that they went through our land use assumptions and they kind of said, hey, here are the triggers these projects would happen with these land use assumptions. And so we just want to have a chance to go back and kind of check through that list. It's a QC chance for us to touch base with them.
I will trust the process.
We've been in close communication with them as well. We've met several times prior to this meeting, and we're going to meet several times after this meeting, I'm sure, so.
I did have a question. So in the spreadsheet. This one, okay, so the spreadsheet that you have, you probably explained it in your presentation, but the headings, left to right, category, lead agency, title, description, pretty straightforward. Cost, pretty straightforward. Plan year, but then the draft final scenario, the plan year, there's a range of different years. Where did the years come from?
So the years are essentially what year we are incorporating the project by within the time horizon. So, we're going from 2025 to 2050, and that's essentially the year that the project would come online. And so for modeling purposes, that's important because we need to know what projects would come online when in order for, air quality conformity modeling, but also for greenhouse gas modeling, because, by 2035, that's our target year. And so we need to know what would come online prior to or up till 2035.
So for example, if it says 2050, it's not as though it couldn't come sooner in the event that there were agencies partnering to come together on a particular project to make it viable or to make it
Correct.
more.
Correct, yeah. So if funding is garnered for that project and it becomes more of a priority, say for a local jurisdiction, and they want to move that project forward quicker, yes, they could definitely do that.
So have you had, the reason I ask is I see 2050 under one of the items under the Great Delta Trail, the conversation's been happening for 25 years or so. It appears there's a lot more energy behind that with other agencies that are now partnering to make that happen. Given that private property owners are now expressing interest and sort of seeing that come to fruition. So 2050 is the current timeline horizon on that project. But that can change. Okay.
Absolutely can
Yeah,
move
fair enough.
way far forward. If you're in the plan, you're consistent with the plan, particularly for those projects that might help us, with air quality, things like that. Those can advance very, very quickly, but the moving of projects around in time is kind of what we do in our programming and project delivery. We're constantly adjusting the scope, schedule, and
So it's probably
timing
more
of those
reflective of its placement if it's either in or out, which it's in. So that in and of itself kind of gives it. Yeah. All right. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any projects that were in the plan that are not in the plan now? Other than those that are built out or completed?
Other than those, there are a number that I know, we tried to give priority to projects that were in the last plan and continue unless things have really changed on that. For instance, Zach mentioned we have some pending discussions with SAC-RT. Currently, the current plan has the green line out to Natomas Town Center. We have conversation with them about, well, is that still feasible within this time horizon? I know they have thoughts about running BRT out to the airport. Maybe as an initial phase, might that get us through the plan? So there are projects that are going to change for sure.
But you're
across
working with
this.
those jurisdictions.
But we're working with those jurisdictions, and it particularly where a project was in the last plan and may not be in this plan. Those are things that we want to make sure we really run by the local staff.
Yeah, we don't want surprises.
So, through Chair, I think this goes back to my original kind of concern about us not seeing ourselves in the plan. Right, and so, I mean, I would just ask this time that I've already reached out to our staff to, schedule a meeting with you all, but this was my concerns back when we first adopted this, right, was like, hey, I don't see it, and I know that Neil was supposed to reach out from Sutter County, and that thing just doesn't set well with me, so.
Is it possible, I mean, I know we're all having these conversations, I have no clue who you talk to, if you talk to anybody in Yolo, so it might be helpful if maybe the next iteration, there's some opportunity to share with us. Have you checked in? Have you had the meetings just as a checkpoint? Because it's clumsy, I think, for us to sit here and assume. I have no clue. I don't know who you talk to. I'm newer on the SACOG board, as many of us are, and so maybe with a check-in, staff can provide that information either visually or however that might make sense to people.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
I think also it could be a matter of the educational process that's ongoing with SACOG around, funding opportunities and how to capture more money by doing different things in your community. And you've been a lot of help, I know, in different parts of the county with that. But it's real, the color of money. You don't get the money unless you do what it wants to do. And maybe there's projects that you could do in different counties that would capture more money.
And Director Baines, to your previous comment, we did meet, what was it, last week or earlier this week? It's escaping me now, with Sutter County folks as well as Yuba City folks to give them kind of a preview and answer any questions they may have on this draft transportation project list. And we're in the process of setting up a subsequent meeting as well with them to really dive into the list and go through project by project if they so wish to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Yep, jump in.
Director Baines, is it the thing that doesn't sit well with you? Was it the 10 million and the 9 million from that previous slide, or is it something in the project list?
So I think it's probably something that I just said list to me. I mean, 10 million and 9 million, but I guess when you look at the billions of dollars for other regions, just doesn't. I mean, I know we have, Sutter Point that is, they're working on it right now. I mean, I understand that a lot of this stuff is, stuff that's been already in the queue, I guess. But I just want to make sure that our staff, and you guys are on the same page. And I mean, that's my biggest concern. And not just our staff, with the city of Yuba City and the jurisdiction within, whether it's Live Oak, I mean, whoever, I just want to make sure that they're represented in this and able to participate in it, like to their fullest capacity, I guess.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think what we were trying to do with the slide that had the 10 million, the 9 million, and Director Hume had a lot of questions on, is say just for that is only a small subset of projects, as Zach and Clint were explaining. And even for those that are in our TIP, that are the near term, those aren't even fully funded. We have to go get additional monies for those, Director Hume, for the RAISE grant, the connector just got, right? And I think the part of the idea is those are hard enough. We should focus on those to get fully funded and move through the process. And that is part of the reason, fiscal constraint, that we can't bring all the other projects in the outer years necessarily in, because there just simply isn't enough funding. I know that chart is a little confusing, and I don't want you to leave here thinking that Sutter County has only got $19 million till 2050, because that's not what it says, right? But we've talked to your staff. We will talk to them again, absolutely. And and try to, you know, figure out how we can, you know, see the same thing here.
Right, thank you. Any other director questions or comments, direction? Got what you need at this juncture?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Right, very good. That then concludes our formal agenda items. Unless there are any other matters that directors want to raise. Seeing none, I think that takes us to our conclusion.
Chair Villegas, can you turn your microphone on, please?
It is on. It is on.
Don't worry, we all heard him during.
It's green. I'm not sure. Yeah. Do I need to repeat any of that? On the very- Yeah, I don't think anybody's gonna argue. I think we're adjourned. Thank you.